Jocelyn, thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Rounds of applause, and many thanks to you and to everybody for our technical glitches or whatnot. About 95% of that music was in fact heard. I'm going to start with a couple questions here for you, Jocelyn. I wanted to ask, I always think of the song, the Love and Spoonful song, Nashville Cats, and there's just and the idea when of course the many times that Bob Dylan went down to Nashville, it just gives you the sense that you could just sort of dip a ladle in and just pull out musicians and pour them into, that there's just so many there. I'm curious about that community. What sorts of supports did the musicians have for each other? Is there a sense where there local unions for them, or ways that they were supportive, or mutual societies? Because it sounds like it's attracting so many people that it might be easy to fail in Nashville as well as it is to survive in Nashville. So any sense of the musical community, maybe in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that is sort of the legendary inventory of great talent that we always hear about? I can't, can we get Jocelyn 1 sec? I can't hear your voice. So.
Aha, we're switching to new technology. I'm now on Zoom. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Great. Yes, okay. I can. Did you hear my question?
I did, fortunately. Okay. So we're talking about sort of the Nashville community and how much of a dream, so many of us had. Gosh, when I was little, I was going to get my guitar and hop a Greyhound bus to Nashville and go become Reba McEntire, and that didn't work out. In the 1960s, when we're drawing all of these musicians into Nashville and the industry is really at this huge growth period, we have to remember that the city was also growing at this time, so there was other employment. You didn't necessarily show up and become a star, but there were certain key figures who would hire and support musicians as they came to town. And there are stories especially of Tom Paul Glaser, who had a recording studio that was called the Glaser Brothers Studio. And the Glaser Brothers were also a recording act, and Tom Paul was also a producer and a performer himself. And their couch, people would come sleep on their couch. And there was this sense that you came to Nashville because you were so hungry to be in the music industry that you would do whatever you needed to do to start out and build your way up. Many of those people who did that did not become stars, but many of them were still working in the industry, because when you have these record labels and these publishing firms there, you have all this other supporting employment opportunity that is still tied into the industry. There's also another joke that if you go to Nashville, every single person who's a wait staff serving your food, every taxi driver, everybody else is also a songwriter. So there's just a thriving aspect of the music that's alive there, even for the people who never make it big. And one of the people who's described very tellingly how that community was working in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is a professor at Belmont University named Don Cusick, who was part of the group of people who came there in that time period because they were so anxious and eager to work in the music industry. Obviously, he's found his career doing a lot of things. He's also done songwriting, but his main income is as a professor and as an author at this point. So that industry is really spread out, and there are lots of different opportunities. The Curb Music Business program at Belmont talks about how the vast majority of their incoming first-year class of college students intend to become performers. And by the time they graduate, a good 80 to 90% of them have decided they want to work in the music industry, but in a different role. So there's a diversity there that happens when you're in that space.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to give another couple questions for Dr. Niels, and then we'll bring in, well, Robert's already here. Hello, Robert, and we'll end up with questions for everybody. Janie Butler asks, in addition to the Opry, what other venues do you recommend to see live country music?
So one of them I actually showed that picture of, which is just going to downtown Lower Broadway. It's Broadway between about 2nd Avenue and about 6th Avenue. Those are the places that a lot of the studio musicians in town and rising people who are still not famous but terrific talent will perform. I always go to Robert's Western World every time I'm there, and often you hop into the stage door next door. And then the Bluebird Cafe is still the place to go for singer-songwriter nights in the round. And for bluegrass, the common recommendation is always the Station Inn. And there are lots of other venues that pop up and down. And then if you want to go just for a little bit further out of town, out near the old Opry land, which is still where the Opry Hotel and the Opry Theater is a little strip called Music Valley. It has the larger location for Ernest Tubbs Record Shop. Willie Nelson is the only one of the big artists who's kept his museum outside of downtown. And there's a really fun venue there called the Nashville Palace that hosts a variety of concerts. And they have a little dance floor and always just some terrific danceable country being played there by cover bands.
And I know, Jocelyn, you were kind enough to join us for one of our virtual happy hours where we were talking about music being affected by COVID. Do you have any sense of, I just assume that many of these venues are struggling. Have you had any sense of how Nashville is coping with the lack of venues right now? And maybe is it being affected by streaming also? Or those are two different questions, but any sense there about the effect of COVID on these venues?
Absolutely. So the whole music industry is just really reeling at every level from a sudden discontinuation of the whole idea of connecting to your fans live through performance. And of course, people get into music because that's what they love. Nashville has really struggled because the live scene was the bread and butter for so many business owners and artists. And they've done a lot of fluctuation back and forth where some of the mandates there have not been as strict as elsewhere. And then they've also seen surges. And there's just been a huge political tension. We've talked about politics a little bit this morning. It's a huge part of how country music sees itself and grapples with itself because it is not a monolith. The fan base is not monolithic and the industry is not monolithic. The artists, the songwriters within the artist community, within the songwriting community, there's no universal agreement on anything from a political stance. And so they're dealing with all of the same struggles that we're seeing across the nation, but I would say amplified because of the smaller community tensions there. There were venues that refused to close. They didn't quite have a government mandate that said they had to. When that mandate finally came, there was just a lot of tension and disagreement. So I think it's really hard when people are looking at both their passion and their livelihood in these times.
And we'll bring Robert in here, but one more question about that government support. Was there any, obviously this is such an important industry for Nashville. I mean, it generated tourist industry. So what kind of, and of course we know this is usually Tennessee is ruled by a Republican Party that doesn't like to spend public money on things. What is the relationship between state support, city support, and is there any attention over this cultural institution and making it survive privately or with public support?
Basically, in the 1950s and 60s, the city government decided to embrace country music. I don't think they really had much of a choice at that point, but there has been some public support for much of what has happened there. The majority of the Country Music Museum and Hall of Fame, however, was private money, specific donors from within the industry, and yet the city has now literally and figuratively linked into that. There's a walkway through, this sort of shopping area that you can get to without leaving the building to connect to the big publicly sponsored performance venues that are now downtown. So I think there's, at the city level, a tremendous amount of support and agreement. I mean, not universal, but somewhat there. And it's been in place for a long time. I was watching an ad, a public tourism ad video from the 1980s. And it was supposed to be about all the things you could come to Nashville for and all the industries that are booming there. It's, of course, a healthcare center, a lot of different buildings there. And yet it started and ended with Music City, USA and the Opry.
Yeah, you can tell, but if you go to Nashville, you don't necessarily have to get a job in music. You might get a job in the health center. All right, well, let's bring Robert in, and it's a nice crossover question for us. And I offer this to both Jocelyn and Robert. Robert, if you would unmute your microphone. Hello there.
There we go. Okay.
There we go. Great. And you're joining us from on stage. It's very nice to see you there. And thank you for that. Great. There's the piano. There's a great performance that we had earlier. So this is a question from Jonathan Gerard, and I offer this to both of you. Do you think that any country music will survive as classical music has? Some folk music has been incorporated into classical compositions. I'm thinking of Coday and, of course, Copeland. Has this occurred with any country music? And I guess I would offer that to both of you, and Jocelyn can comment after Robert about what makes classic music.
I'm sorry, Robert, did you want to take this first, or do you want me to?
Doesn't matter.
Why don't we start with Robert, and then we'll jump to Jocelyn.
So that's a great question. I think that first of all, the term classical music is problematic. I mean, what is it? I mean, what we refer to a certain tradition as classical, but so, but I think the short answer is yes, it will survive. I think because like Brahms and Schoenberg, today we are so obsessed with history. It's a good thing. So I think that there will be preservation of the music. I think that also what I was saying about classical music being a problematic term. One thing I didn't talk about too much was the fact that everything that I played is deeply influenced by some kind of folk music. Brahms, Hungarian music, in the same way that I guess Appalachian music influenced a lot of the Nashville sound and Delta blues, Mozart, Haydn. I think that the influence of folk music is there. I had a professor theory professor who compared it to food. He said that folk music is like the fresh organic food, and then classical music is, not to disparage it, but it's like canned food that's preserved and packaged differently, written out. So I think that it's all genre elitism is something I'm big against. So, but yeah, I don't know. Does that completely answer?
I think that definitely answers. And I am looking forward to. I do want to hear sometime in the future, in some very formal music setting with an orchestra, a little theme of the Gambler running through the string section or something. I can easily predict that happening. Jocelyn, do you want to comment on this relationship between classical and country music, if you will?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this for me echoes what Robert was saying. And also it invites self-reflection, because so many of our own ideas about what is classical music, what is country music, and how it will or will not, quote, survive or persevere or be preserved, has to do with our own fandom and what we listen to and what we value. And that's deep-seated, and sometimes it's things we're conscious of, and sometimes it's things we're not even conscious of. But the idea of country music surviving or persevering or lasting, it's already done all of that. The themes that you hear in the modern recordings often pull on fiddle tunes that were around for hundreds of years, sometimes even longer, that have passed down through mostly oral traditions. And one of the things that often gets in the way of our thinking here has to do with notation. And many people talk about, if Robert and I go down to the music library on campus, there's a big imposing set of shelves that have the M3s, like the collected editions of classical composers, and I put scare quotes around every one of those terms. And there isn't the notated version of that for this kind of country music traditions that we're talking about. But if we can get away from this kind of valorization of the printed collected works edition in paper, I think it's a lot easier to see that this music is surviving and persevering. And you're going to hear quotes to answer Max's question. A Charlie Daniels recording from the 80s or 90s is going to have fiddle tunes quoted in it that are 200, 300 years old. So that music is lasting. And for people who grew up with it, it's part of their deep-seated knowledge and oral tradition. And they know the tunes, they know the music. It's not going anywhere for them.
Well, I just would like to add one thing, that you have given us some notation of the 12-tone piece in that on the banjo. Thank you for that. That's amazing and fantastic. And Robert, you wanted to comment on that?
The thing with what Jocelyn brought up about notation is such a fascinating subject, and because notation is just problematic. And if notation told us everything, we wouldn't need to study music. So interpretation, maybe what's written is 50% or less of what the music actually is, because music's sound. So, and I think that the notation loses a lot. There's a lot of speculation, but we don't have recordings of how Mozart played, Beethoven played. What I believe, that there's more flexibility in that music than we think, hence more folk influence than we might think. So they were all improvisers. And according to Richard Taruskin, if I'm saying his name right, that we have this idea of, say, the Parthenon, for example. It's this all marble white structure. But he says actually in ancient Greece, the Parthenon was painted with these elaborate colors, loud,
even garish.
And so that actually performance practice in the so-called classical in the 18th century was similar. It was a similar idea. It was wild, and it was expressive, and it wasn't metronomic. They did so. But anyway, I think it's just that notation is problematic. Yeah.
That always makes those of us who play guitar and have a difficult time reading music feel very good. It's overrated.
It is.
Uh, I have a question for Robert, but I think also I would, it's an opening for Jocelyn as well. And it's kind of, again, we're wading in the same territories. It's a very personal question for you, Robert. Obviously, your career gravitated towards classical music, but given your upbringing, did you ever play country music, for example, with your father? This is from Joan and James Evans. And I guess I would stretch that after you address that, Robert, that Jocelyn, how do we think about like music? I just don't think of you as a scholar of country music. I think of you as a scholar of music. So what is it that genres do to us? So Robert, I guess personally address that question, but I'm just curious to continue that conversation about crossover.
Totally going to interrupt. Robert, will you turn around and play the tune that you and I were talking about playing?
Well, this one?
Oh, sure.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, because I play country music with my dad. We did concerts actually together. He sings. I don't sing. Well, I can harmonize a little bit. So I have a bad voice, so for singing, that is. So yeah, and it's a dilemma because it's like there have actually been moments, and I don't tell anyone I said this, so it's public, but I think like, I wish I could just, why not just go off and do country music, because I love it so much. I think it's genre. It's like the beauty of living in the age we live in. The danger is, well, I don't have to say, but I think the beauty is that music can be like this big buffet, and if you like one food, it doesn't exclude liking another. So it's all. And there's a story. So remember, I said that Gershwin and Schoenberg played tennis together. I believe Alban Berg came to visit or something. They met with Gershwin. And Gershwin was nervous around Alban Berg because he admired him, and Gershwin felt that he wasn't quite as prestigious, or whatever the word is. And I think the story is Berg put his hand on Gershwin's shoulder or something, and he said, music is music. It's all the same thing. So,
it's decorating time with sound. I think that's what Frank Zappa said, which I will always appreciate. Jocelyn, any thoughts? And why did you? What is it about that particular piece that triggered you?
Sure. So what I was hoping Robert would do, and which of course he just played along and did, no pun intended, was cover a little bit of a Floyd Kramer tune called Last Date, which was a huge hit in 1962. It actually only made it to #2 on the country charts because another song that Floyd Kramer had played on the recording for beat it out for the #1 slot. He was a pianist known for that slip note style. You heard Robert doing those little grace notes. That's that slip note style. And he's an example of, I think, exactly what Robert was demonstrating for you and what I talked about earlier, that musicians themselves work across genres and across styles. And it's really fans who are seeking a way to express identity, that kind of cultural identity we were talking about, that compartmentalize the music more strictly. So Robert was just covering a little Floyd Kramer 60s country hit for us, and playing it beautifully, just like the pianists in Nashville at that time period were trained, not exactly like Robert, but they had their degrees from Peabody and Eastman too. So it's all mixed and mingled in there. And I hope you're hearing all of us this morning talk about how music doesn't sit within genre borders any more than people sit within borders.
For sure. One of the things you said, Jocelyn, that I thought was really interesting was about the three sort of prongs of the performance, the performance, the publishing, and the recording were all there, and it provided this sort of the platform for this community to grow out of with these mutually supportive pillars. There's such a, classical music, I don't think of the recording of classical music as much as I think of the performance of it. And I don't think of the publishing of it, which of course is obviously a major piece of this as well. Did Vienna have that sort of community of mutual supporting parts of the music community the way that Nashville had?
As far as I know, yes. There's Viennese publishing. But I don't know too much in detail, so I can't really fully answer.
Well, I have a follow-up to that, and actually gets to something that I mentioned that we didn't take on, and that is streaming and the new world of music that we're entering into, which has really, a lot of songwriters are not very happy about the returns that they're getting from things like Spotify, etc. So can a musical community grow in the same way, in this sort of localized way, that we see in Nashville and Vienna, can that happen? I mean, of course, we put big scare quotes around everything because of COVID. We know it can't happen right now, but in a new world, what does it take to create a geographical musical community like this if sort of two of those pillars, recording and publishing, are no longer as guaranteed to provide work for people? Any thoughts on that, Jocelyn?
Sure. So the answer is yes, you can build it, but it's in new ways and it's not linked to the old models of publishing and recording. And the place that we see it is honestly TikTok and YouTube. There's some great research happening. Some of our graduate students are writing right now about people, songwriters and performers, who have created a following. When you talk about that community, you measure it and identify it through the likes, the follows, the subscriptions, and the commenting in that space. The fans get to kind of know each other. And this is not chump change. Some of these artists are extremely popular. They're usually very young, very tech savvy people. And they are really cultivating this senses of community, but the publishing piece of it for now is a little bit out of it. Most artists, even the ones that are wildly successful, create their own publishing firms now because you no longer need the infrastructure of the companies when they're starting out, and they can retain their own publishing royalties that way, which is a good revenue stream. But yeah, you can form the community online, and we've seen huge hits come out of that process. The most famous, I have to say it out loud, Old Town Road.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. You know, it's I hear that and absolutely support it because of that sort of the great democratizing influence that has on production of music. But it does, and then again, saying this in the midst of what we're this pandemic, where I miss live music and I miss, you know, so I'm not sure if that's ever going to be as satisfying as a locality. Like I was saying about Nashville, dip a ladle in, you're going to pour musicians out of it. I know I can find 1 million musicians online. So I only add that comment to say, I do hope that we can have geographical communities, you know, again, and that maybe there's a way to find those two elements to support each other. I have a question here from our dear, Jocelyn, you want to add something to that?
I was just going to say, I feel like some of this is where it might be showing our age here, because my teens and preteens, they watch for their favorite YouTubers to come on, and they curl up with their little devices in their bedroom, and they have an incredibly moving experience with that live broadcast from somebody. And it's just of a different time and place than you know, what we grew up with.
And I have to say, most of my going and seeing live music occurred in the 90s when the bars were full of smoke, and I probably smoked about 4,000 packs of cigarettes while I played music on these stages and whatnot. But so
Nexus, they still are.
So we have a question here from our good friend Lloyd Kramer. Hello, Lloyd. We hear often about a rural-urban split in politics. Is there a rural-urban differential in the people who listen to country music and classical European music? If so, is this differential growing or declining? And
Robert?
Well, I guess I'll try to speak about classical music. And hi, Lloyd Kramer. And actually, I want to thank Lloyd Kramer. I met him in January, and I think it's through him to get to do this.
Yeah, he told us about you, and we caught you. So
forgot to mention it in the open. And also, I like the name Lloyd Kramer. It does sound like Floyd Kramer, the country pianist. So, but at any rate, I think there's two things to consider. So let's talk about classical music in this country, which is I say it's different from Europe. So in this country, it has always had this connotation as being this kind of elitist, for better or worse, this elitist thing, imported from Europe. And I think that many composers, US composers, particularly in the middle of the mid-20th century, were trying to, first of all, incorporate, like Copland was mentioned in one of the questions, and not only Copland, but Bernstein and Gershwin and William Grant Still, Charles Ives. I mean, there's so many great composers neglected, Roy Harris, who they were putting folk influence into their music with this notion of reaching more people, that it's not being this narrow thing. I guess there's also the talk about the decline of like middle brow culture, whatever that term. So I think there was a better attempt at, I mean, I don't like the term, but there was a better attempt at democratizing the music in the middle of the 20th century. Because remember, like Leopold Stokowski would conduct symphonies of William Grant Still. We don't hear it as much now. I don't know why, but maybe it's time again to do that. So I think it's in this country, I hate to say it, but it's classical music is pretty much an urban and probably elitist thing. It just is, and I wish there was more outlet to. Oh, but on the other hand, when I've done concerts, some of my favorite concerts are just I'll go to a church or a retirement community somewhere out in you know somewhere out in a rural area, and the reception will be wonderful. And it's just because music's music, So, and then as far as Europe, I think I can't speak too much because I don't know really, but when I've been to Europe, I know that it's like everyone knows, or it's not knows, but everyone really sort of likes classical music. It's more widespread. Like I've talked to like truck drivers who they say they like to listen to, Beethoven or something while they're driving. So actually, I was once in Paris and I was in this cafe on the outskirts of town, and was in my broken French. I was talking to this guy who I don't know. I think he worked there. He was saying that he loved Pierre Boulez, and that's unthinkable probably in this country. Just at some random place to meet someone. So I think the U.S. we need to do better about making classical music.
I want to give you my word that if you want to go and get a keyboard out into a rural setting in North Carolina, Carolina Public Humanities would love to be part of that.
I'd love to do it.
And so we'll work on that for sure. Thoughts, Jocelyn?
Yes, so many thoughts. One of them is that I'm fairly confident that all of us logged into this call today don't even agree on what we think country music is and where the borders of that are. I'm sure there are bluegrass fans on here. I saw posts on Facebook yesterday from bluegrass fans making fun of country music. There are plenty of scholarly reasons to explain that those are parts and parcel of one genre. So it's really hard to generalize that level. And I'm also thinking back to Willie Nelson, who was famously performing in the 1970s for a large crowd. And he recognized that his crowd consisted of two radically different, thoroughly opposing political perspectives. And he was like, it's all good. Everybody's here. Welcome. Let's just listen to the music. There is some of a urban-rural division in the country fan base within it, and it has to do with what kinds of music within country they're listening to, how they hear it, how they associate with it, how they identify with it. And there's also a very prominent way in which in certain parts of the country, especially rural areas, country music is considered just the natural soundscape. And I grew up in New Mexico. And when I'm in the Southwest, in a lot of places that are not urban, country music is sort of the default music you're going to hear in public spaces, in shopping areas, in dining establishments, not marked as country, but just as music. So there certainly is, across this huge nation, a lot of variation in what we kind of naturally gravitate for as a community in our soundtrack.
Yeah, I think just as a little personal note, my son is 22 years old, and he is a college student at the University of South Carolina, and his soundtrack coming when he's visiting us now, coming out of his room is, well, number one, very loud, and number two, oscillates between Atlanta trap rap and very contemporary country songs, like modern, gonna get some whiskey baby, the songs. And so I just think it's and here's us not in these genres are just completely played one after the other without any thought about their different worlds. It's his world of music incorporates all of that, so it certainly belies a real divide and whatnot. I just want to throw out two things here. Alice has a couple jokes. One is from, of course, the line from the Blues Brothers. We like country and Western. And then, of course, we are missing Lloyd Kramer's voice here. Normally, we'd have Lloyd Kramer probably entering in with a Beatles song. So it'd have to be one of maybe Rocky Raccoon or one that's a little bit more Americana or something that we would normally hear Lloyd chiming in. So we're sorry you can't hear Lloyd's voice, Alice. We all miss it. Maybe not Joe Rytalk. Okay, and a question here, does Robert perform? And if so, where?
Well, not now.
Meeser Hall, Saturday, October 23rd.
Yeah.
Any plans? Do you have, what is it like to be a musician gigless?
It's weird, but it's weird for everyone right now. So I'm planning, I've been planning for a long time, but I'm planning to just do more recordings. for the time being. But recording for me, like today, I mean, I'm grateful to this, such a wonderful event, but recording scares me because it's, when there's an audience, it's something like Max was saying, there's something about live music that just, there's an atmosphere that, I mean, I still feel good, you know, vibes from everyone, so, but there's an atmosphere there that you can, so I just hope that soon we'll come back and there'll be the chance I can go to Vienna and do that all-American program and play around here, and I don't know, wherever. I'll play wherever. You have a piano and some people, I'll play.
All right, great. Maybe we'll have to have masks or whatnot. We'll figure it out. Jocelyn, I know you're a talented musician as well as a brilliant scholar. Are you playing music at all, or are you finding any way to exercise that part of your brain and mind?
It's been so hard, and yet a small glimmer of a silver lining is the amount of honestly technology that musicians who never confronted that are now doing. Many of us are getting better at sound engineering and recording and video editing and skills that, you know, are so useful to have now. I'm teaching my songwriting course right now at UNC, and normally, you know, it's a bring your guitar and we work on the songs live, and now the students are learning a whole lot of audio production as well, because we have to. So that's my only silver lining in this switched world.
So we feel the same way, and you know, and we do thank you and Robert and anyone who encountered some of our difficulties today. We apologize. We're all learning on this in this new world, and we hope that we'll be 10 times better next year. But I want to specifically thank two people who have just been working tirelessly for the past 2 weeks on this, and today have been running around working on this as well. And that's Paul Bonici and Jesse Moorfield. Paul is really our sine qua non for what we've been doing in this virtual world. So thank you, Paul, for that. And Jesse, this has been a real honor working with the music department. So again, I want to thank David Garcia, Jesse Moorfield, Jeffrey Fuchs, Kat Zachary from the music department, our good friend Steve Anderson, who is our liaison here with the music department. And of course, let's put our hands together for Jocelyn Neal and Robert Buxton. Thank you so much, both of you. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for your patience with this whole process. We could have done it recorded. We could have done it recorded. Maybe we should have, but at any rate, we've really had a wonderful morning and early afternoon with you, and we hope to be doing this live at some point. So, thank you.
Thank you.
And we thank all of you for joining us, and Carolina Public Humanities signing off. Thank you.